Welcome Dark Night Tales. In 1860, a young black girl named Abigail Foster stitched beauty into a world that showed her none. Every thread she sewed carried a secret pain history tried to erase. Tonight's story is not just about extraordinary talent, but about survival in silence, suffering behind perfection, and a life the world chose not to see. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from, your country, your city, and if stories built on real historical research matter to you, subscribe and stay with us, because every story here is the result of deep digging into forgotten truths. The year 1860 stood on the edge of catastrophe in the United States, a nation split between wealth built on bondage and a growing fear that the system could no longer survive. Slavery was not only legal, it was protected, normalized, and woven into everyday life across the southern states. Enslaved black children were born into ownership, not citizenship. Their futures decided before they could speak their own names. Laws recognized them as property, not people, and punishment was written into the system as discipline, not cruelty. For enslaved girls, the world was even narrower. Childhood ended early, replaced by endless labor inside kitchens, fields, and sewing rooms. Talent was never nurtured, it was exploited. Any unusual skill, whether music, craftsmanship, or sewing, did not bring opportunity but heavier chains, because it increased an enslaver's profit. Education was forbidden, rest was rationed, and obedience was demanded through fear. This was the world Abigail Foster entered, a society where beauty could be created by black hands, yet those hands remained bound. Every stitch she would one day sew existed within this brutal structure, where excellence did not mean freedom, and survival often required silence. In 1860 America, suffering was not accidental, it was the foundation. Abigail Foster was born into a life that offered no protection, no promises, and no choice. As a black child in 1860, her earliest memories were shaped by command and consequence rather than care. Childhood, as the world understands it, barely existed for her. From the moment she could walk, she was expected to observe, obey, and endure. Laughter was dangerous, curiosity was punished, and mistakes, no matter how small, could carry lasting scars. She grew up surrounded by adults who worked from before sunrise until long after dark, their exhaustion silently teaching her what the future held. There were no toys, no schooling, no sense of safety. Instead, there were whispered warnings, hurried movements, and the constant pressure to remain unseen. Hunger was familiar, fear was constant. Affection, when it existed at all, came in fleeting moments stolen between labor. Even as a child, Abigail learned that her body and time did not belong to her. Her worth would be measured only by usefulness. This early conditioning shaped her silence, sharpened her awareness, and forced her to mature far too soon. Long before her talent was discovered, Abigail's childhood had already been taken, replaced by survival in a world that never intended to let her be a child at all. Abigail's gift was not uncovered through encouragement or education. It was discovered by accident, in the quiet corners of forced labor. As a small girl assigned to domestic work, she spent hours watching older women mend torn garments and stitch worn fabrics late into the night. She absorbed everything in silence, the movement of hands, the tension of thread, the patience required to turn scraps into something wearable. Without lessons or permission, she began to imitate what she saw, using discarded needles and leftover fabric. Abigail practiced in secrecy. Her first stitches were uneven, her fingers often pricked and bleeding, but she persisted. What set her apart was not speed, it was instinct. She understood symmetry, fit, and detail in a way that startled those who eventually noticed. When a torn dress was returned mended so perfectly it seemed unpackaged, questions were asked. When another garment came back improved rather than repaired, suspicion turned into interest. The moment her talent was recognized, her life changed, but not for the better. What could have been nurtured became claimed. Her sewing was no longer quiet experimentation, it became expectation. The discovery of her skill marked the end of what little anonymity she had left. From that day forward, every stitch she sewed belonged not to her, but to those who owned her labor. As Abigail's sewing became known, her work began to circulate far beyond the walls where she labored. Dresses she stitched were worn at gatherings she would never attend, admired under chandeliers she would never stand beneath. Wealthy women praised the precision of the seams, the elegance of the cuts, and the way the fabric seemed to fall effortlessly into place. Some even asked, half in curiosity, half in disbelief, who had made such remarkable clothing. But Abigail was never introduced as an artist. She was spoken of as a useful girl, a silent pair of hands behind the beauty. Her enslavers accepted compliments that were never meant for them, taking credit while increasing the demands placed upon her. Orders multiplied. Expectations grew heavier. What astonished elites was not just the quality of the clothing, but the fact that it came from someone they refused to see as fully human. Each admired garment tightened the grip on Abigail's life. The better her work became, the less freedom she had. She was pushed to sew finer details, meet impossible deadlines, and replicate styles she had only glimpsed from a distance. Her talent elevated the status of others, while deepening her own suffering, proving a cruel truth of her world. Excellence did not bring recognition, it brought captivity dressed in silk. As demand for Abigail's work grew, daylight was no longer enough. Her sewing stretched deep into the night, long after others had collapsed from exhaustion. By flickering candlelight, she bent over fabric until her back ached and her eyes burned. Silence filled the room, broken only by the soft pull of thread and the quiet fear of making a mistake. Every stitch had to be perfect, because imperfection carried consequences. Sleep became a luxury she rarely knew. Her fingers stiffened, swollen and scarred from constant work, yet rest was not an option. If a seam came undone or a dress failed to impress, blame fell solely on her. There were no allowances for fatigue, no mercy for youth. The night hours were not hers, they were claimed, just like her days. In those endless nights, sewing became both refuge and prison. It was the only place where she could focus her mind, yet it was also where her suffering deepened. While others dreamed, Abigail stitched beauty into garments she would never wear, pouring her strength into creations that erased her existence. The needle never stopped, and neither did the quiet toll it took on her body and spirit. Abigail's talent quickly became a commodity, something to be measured not by artistry, but by profit. Her enslavers realized that her sewing could elevate their status and bring financial advantage, and from that moment, Her skill was no longer just useful, it was exploited. She was assigned more work than any other child her age, trusted with the finest fabrics, yet denied the simplest kindness. Orders were taken in her name, but she never heard the terms. Dresses were promised on impossible timelines, and Abigail was expected to fulfill them without question. When visitors praised the craftsmanship, those in power smiled and accepted payment, while Abigail remained hidden in back rooms, bent over fabric, unseen and uncredited. Her hands created value she would never touch. The cruelest part was that her talent erased her right to rest. Because she was gifted, more was demanded. Her skill became the reason her suffering intensified, not eased. In a world that measured worth by usefulness, Abigail's extraordinary ability trapped her deeper in bondage, proof that brilliance, when owned by others, becomes just another tool of control. Perfection was not admired in Abigail's world, it was required. Every garment she produced carried an unspoken threat: fail, and you would pay for it. A crooked seam, a torn stitch, or a delayed order could lead to harsh punishment, no matter how small the mistake or how exhausted she was. There was no room for explanation, no allowance for youth or pain. Fear became part of her craft. Punishment was not always loud or public. Sometimes it came as withheld food, forced isolation, or longer hours at the needle. Other times it arrived swiftly and violently, reinforcing the lesson that her body existed to obey. The beauty of her work stood in cruel contrast to the reality behind it. Elegant dresses created under terror, refinement born from suffering. This constant pressure reshaped Abigail from the inside. She learned to sew not just with skill, but with dread, each stitch placed as an act of self-preservation. The punishment behind perfection ensured her silence and obedience, proving that in her world, excellence was enforced not by praise, but by fear. Despite the cruelty surrounding her, Abigail was still a child, and like all children, she carried quiet dreams. They were not grand or unrealistic. She did not dream of wealth or fame, but of simple freedoms, choosing when to rest, sewing for herself, wearing something made by her own hands, or walking without being called back. These thoughts stayed unspoken, hidden deep inside where punishment could not reach. But dreaming itself was dangerous. The world around her constantly reminded her that hope led to disappointment, and imagination could be mistaken for defiance. Any sign of longing beyond her assigned role was discouraged, corrected, or crushed. She learned to bury her wishes beneath obedience, to keep her eyes lowered and her thoughts guarded. Over time, those unspoken dreams faded, worn down by exhaustion and fear. The future was never hers to imagine. It was already decided by others. What remained was survival, one day at a time. Abigail's greatest loss was not just freedom, but the right to believe her life could ever be different. Abigail's gift came with a price she never agreed to pay. In another world, her talent might have opened doors, offered education, or brought recognition. In hers, it did the opposite. The more exceptional her sewing became, the heavier the burden placed upon her. Skill marked her not as special, but as useful, and usefulness meant relentless demands. Her body bore the cost first. Long hours bent over fabric damaged her posture, weakened her hands, and drained her strength. Illness was ignored. Pain was treated as inconvenience. Emotionally, the toll was just as severe. She learned that her value existed only in what she produced, not in who she was. Praise never reached her, punishment always did. Being gifted did not protect Abigail, it trapped her. Her talent, instead of becoming a path forward, became a chain refined by expectation. The cost of being gifted in a world built on oppression was clear. Excellence did not lead to freedom, only deeper captivity disguised as opportunity. Abigail Foster's life was never meant to be remembered. There were no records written in her voice, no portraits bearing her name, no acknowledgement of the hands that created such beauty. History preserved the dresses, the wealth, and the reputations, but erased the child who paid for them. Like so many others, Abigail existed in the shadows of ledgers and oral whispers, her suffering considered unworthy of record. What survives are fragments, indirect mentions, unnamed labor, admired craftsmanship without credit. Her story had to be reconstructed from absence itself, from what was taken without acknowledgement. This erasure was intentional. Remembering her would have required admitting the cruelty behind refinement, the violence behind elegance. To tell Abigail's story now is an act of defiance against that silence. Though history tried to bury her, it failed completely. Her life stands as testimony to countless gifted children whose brilliance was exploited and erased, and whose truth still demands to be seen.